Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the report that we launched just 2 days ago. If you saw the event, you probably saw that there was some breaking the connection there. I was actually speaking from London. Tim, I actually met with Jenny there. So we ran into each other, which was very nice. But so we presented this, and then we had a panel discussion. And today I'm gonna make it short because I would very much like to hear your feedback on it as well. And so just to start on it, and maybe I can tell you a little bit of the background on how this came into being in terms of doing the report. And it's interesting because, sandboxes is a concept that has been used in different policy spaces. If you are into policy experimentations, regulatory sandboxes have been very much used around fintech, really to enable companies, innovators to test their solutions in a controlled environment. Usually, they come with a series of characteristics, such as being time bound and being specific to some actors. It has a big evaluation component into it as well. And it's interesting here because now they've been used more and more into different spaces. But typically, sandboxes are used within a local context, regulatory sandboxes as such. And at the other hand, we have also the idea of operational sandboxes, which we use to encapsulate the notion of how sandboxes have been used in the corporate environment to really test algorithms using control data sets. So thinking about those two sort of types of sandboxes, it really got us thinking in terms of how this could be used for data. And one of the things that really triggered my own thinking around how this could be explored further was that a provision was included in 2019 in one of the first digital economy partnership agreements between Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand, anticipating that within their cooperation framework, they wanted to have sandboxes for data. And so, of course, this was just an article in a long trade agreement that they did, and no one was implementing it. No one had written about how you actually get there, because that would be a cross-border sandbox involving not only domestic actors, but more than one actor across borders. And that really was interesting because so many of the issues that we've been discussing are ones that are relevant for different countries at the same time. They're really cross borders. That's why we've been talking about the Datasphere as such. So started thinking about this, talking to a lot of people, and the UK government really got interested in us writing more about this. So this is a bit of the background on how that we got to do this report, and on the idea that there's so many different silos that already exist domestically, and sandboxes can serve as this space for more cooperation. And how can we use this and incorporate it cross-border? So in a nutshell, as I mentioned, we look into this typology of two types of sandboxes: operational ones that are pretty much the spaces where data can be pulled and handled, and on the other hand, regulatory sandboxes that really are that space to provide dialogue and guidance on how data is handled within regulatory frameworks. But talking about those two types doesn't mean that those are the two types that exist, especially because we can think about hybrid models as well. But this is a simplification around the sort of two archetypes of sandboxes that could exist. And then we did a literature review and a case review on how sandboxes can be useful. On one hand, sandboxes can be used for useful to companies because they're helpful in reducing regulatory and legal uncertainty, and really giving innovators that access to controlled testing environments, really, which facilitates market entry, especially with emerging technology, so that it's useful to really enable new entrants and to really access more, to really foster more innovation. So regulatory sandboxes really can offer this better sense of clarity and certainty for regulators, for innovators. For society, it's interesting because some of the benefits is then when the outcomes of sandboxes are published, they can really help drive greater public and political understanding of those evolving technologies, of the different practices, rules, and norms as well. For regulators, and that's the very interesting part for me, is that all the case studies that we looked into show that sandboxes provide a first-hand contact of regulators with the latest technological developments and solutions. And that's something that I realized going to different industry meetups as well, and talking with people that are on the ground trying to innovate with different data related services, is that some of the vocabulary that is being used in those spaces is not even part of the portfolio of understanding of policymakers or meetings that are taking place internationally. So how can we bridge those two worlds? So sandboxes have been shown to really enable policymakers and regulators to have an insight on what's happening in terms of technology, and reduce some of the misunderstandings as well on their part, thinking about how technology itself can help achieve different policy objectives. And then finally, sandboxes, when they are developed in a multi-stakeholder way, can really help build consensus and trust and more collaboration among different stakeholders across boundaries, which is something that we clearly care when we're talking about data. And so how can we transpose this to data, to the data world? So as we know, data underpins all types of different economic sectors and social activities. And sandboxes could support and really help respond to the emerging innovations and really answer to some of the friction and bottlenecks that exist across sectors and policy areas. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. But really, to summarize, regulatory sandboxes could be that key part of data-grounded regulatory policy and legislative development as well. So it's taking a page of how innovation is done, which is typically in an interactive fashion, and really applying in how policy, how norms can be developed in really in an evidence-based environment where we're actually testing and evaluating for what works and what doesn't. So the report also looks into what kind of innovative solutions we could test in sandboxes. And of course, that's just a cut of what is possible to be experimented with, but we highlight at least 3 different strands of innovations. The first one is the notion of emerging intermediaries, and here in this bundle we include a lot of different things, right? So thinking about the role of different data fiduciaries that are emerging now, with different guises and services that are being offered as well. data trusts, data cooperatives, data commons, and I'm happy to have Martin talk about this later, and that's why I think it was useful for me to do that presentation prior to his own presentation that I'm sure you're gonna love. They're doing very interesting things. And data stewards as well are another example there. Other types of technology, and that doesn't mean that they come separately. Many of them are mixing those different technologies and roles together, are privacy enhancing technologies. Thinking about here examples such as homomorphic encryption, about trusted execution environments, about multi-party computation like federated computing, for example, differential privacy methods, etc. And then finally, we look into browser solutions for consent management. And we can also think about other data management solutions, such as data lineage services, for example. So all of these are things that are emerging, they're developing, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated each day. And so how we could test those kind of solutions and those new business models as well in those spaces across border. And that's what we try to unpack in the report. Finally, we also look into where this is the big bulk of sort of the analysis, where they could be potentially applied, what are the challenges in terms of bottlenecks that exist regarding data sharing, but also what are the low-hanging fruits that already exist in those sectors, what are the good practices that could be, that we can learn from different sectors as well in terms of standardization, building trust, data sharing. And so we look into 4 areas. The first one is related to trade, really. And then we look into, for example, the example of DIPA is one of the ones that we include, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, such as this new way to think about trade agreements that is emerging around the world, but also in terms of the regional agreements that are emerging. And we look into the example that took place in ASEAN in partnership with GSMA to do a cross-border sandbox for data that unfortunately didn't go anywhere, but it's also a good place for us to try to understand why it didn't go anywhere, and was it too big of a group for us to do that? So we're also trying in the report to gather lessons from this example. We look into health and its and inclusion around health, and this was a section that Carolina contributed to it, so she can tell you more about it in the chat. We look into mobility as well, and its impact and effects on sustainability, social and environmental. And we had someone who's an expert on that, I think it was who Carolina was mentioning, Dave Clifford, write that part. He has a lot of experience around data and data sharing mobility.
And the person that I want to bring, it's somebody that Dave recommends, but yeah, Dave was the author.
But it's interesting because here we actually mentioned the example of emissions data, which is a project that Cine is working with. So you see them tagged there and referenced in the report. And then we look into the area of biodiversity and its value for research, science, and development, which is all very interesting because at least these two last sectors or areas, they look very much into non-personal data as well, or a mix of personal and non-personal, which makes it particularly interesting when we're trying to think about new modes of cooperation. So finally, here we look into not only the opportunities, but the challenges of implementing sandboxes. And they include how do we really square the circle of applying a systems approach to data governance and the difficulty of using sandboxes at scale, because they tend to be high, they tend to have high costs, and there are obstacles to getting funds to ensure that they're working well. especially across borders, but also on the difficulties and the barriers of addressing the different understandings that regulators from different countries have on different concepts, on what words mean, on their own understanding of risk, due to really diverse regulatory or even cultural backgrounds as well. And the report looks into how this could be addressed as well. Very last part of the report is really looking into how sandboxes for data, which don't mean I don't mean by this simply regulatory sandboxes, but sandboxes using a hybrid approach as well, where we actually managing data and also trying to ensure this kind of flexible, time-bound regulatory experimentation space. So the different steps are really around choosing the partner, the issues, and then setting the strategy, identifying how to engage different stakeholders, what are the roles of different stakeholders as well, agreeing on the format, on the duration, on what the funding is, then addressing the key issues and any information asymmetries and risks that may exist in the exercise. And then the final and very important part that usually is left out of a lot of policy implementation is setting up the criteria for evaluation and really measuring the success and the failure of each sandbox so that the lessons learned can inform future sandboxes, because the interesting thing about sandboxes is really this iterative characteristic of it. And the conclusion is that cross-border sandboxes could be used to establish compliant but agile data governance, and that it can help solve problems that other more linear or traditional methods usually struggle with. The other one is also that sandboxes for data across border are very much in their infancy. So we don't know yet the scope and the scale of the issues that they can resolve, and time and resources will be needed to really pilot and establish what institutional frameworks or principles need to be set in place, but also what are the formal and informal working mechanisms that we'll need. And another conclusion is that where innovation is barred by uncertainty, there is an opportunity to apply sandboxes models to unlock different opportunities. And so the report covered many issues, but it still leaves a lot of open questions that need to be addressed, such as the ones of can legal restrictions regarding mandates to store data locally be made more flexible by regulatory sandboxes? Or how do cross-border sandboxes operate in a context of mixed data sets as well, of different types of levels of requirement and risks and protection of data, be it personal, non-personal, corporate or not, and those typically tend to be the bottlenecks of those kind of cooperation agreements, be them across border or domestic, or even only between corporations. And another one is, what should be the fiduciary responsibilities of cross-border data intermediaries if we are to experiment with those new business models within operational sandboxes or within regulatory sandboxes or different hybrid sandboxes in general? So we also talked about, and I wanted to share with you a bit of the next steps. We are going to put together an experts group after the summer to continue discussing this and exploring further. We're looking for different partners and people that want to pilot sandboxes with us. And we're very much interested in different countries and innovators that have interesting experience to share. And we put out a survey to really listen from what kind of challenges people think and experts think that could be addressed by sandboxes as well. What are the different opportunities? So with this, I invite you to fill up the survey, and we can put it in the chat. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from you, and I'll stop sharing my screen.